Welcome, everyone, to the PFF Fantasy Podcast IDP edition. I'm John Macri, and I'll be going over the top 10-ish IDP takeaways from Week 9, a week that saw Myles Garrett explode with a 3-sack performance. Josh Hines-Allen got a couple himself. Josh Sweat got a couple too. A big week for the folks who trusted the process. So hopefully you did, because that is absolutely the reward we've been waiting for, and why playing for upside can be so crucial to our fantasy success for both, the year and week to week. So obviously, as someone who's been preaching patience, I'm happy to with the results this week, and it means I don't really have to spend any time this week highlighting low output pass rushers, because those are the examples right there of what the upside of patience can look like. Instead, we could focus on the relevant changes in the IDP landscape for teams and players that we need to be aware of in order to best set our lineups and attack the waiver wire heading into week 10. And if there are situations or players, again, that you want to hear more about, or maybe that I didn't cover in this episode, feel free to ask in the comments, and I'll do my best to highlight them either down the road, or if I can answer quickly in the comments, I'll do that as well. Otherwise, this will be, again, top 10-ish takeaways, and we'll have the IDP Fantasy Report out on Tuesday around noon Eastern time as well, which will have all the snap counts, data, notes, waiver wire targets for the entire week, which you can get access to with a PFF Plus subscription. You get access to the IDP rankings and all of our fantasy rankings and tools over here at PFF as well. All right, let's get into the takeaways now, and we'll start with some optimism out of the Motor City, aka Hockey Town, aka home of North America's team, the Detroit Lions, because Jack Campbell, for the second week in a row, is up over 90% of the team's defensive snaps. He led the team in total tackles this week as well with 10, and maybe, just maybe, we can start to trust him in a wider range of IDP formats. He played 95% of snaps last week, for those of you that were listening to that one. We covered that, and then 92% this week as well. So I just hope this means that, the reverse nepotism that we were seeing from Dan Campbell directed toward his son Jack is finally over. But again, like I said last week, this is something that the Lions have teased us with in Campbell's rookie year, like giving him a 90% snap share and then taking it away. But we've never seen him play back-to-back games of over 90% of snaps, which is really what has me most optimistic about Jack Campbell now, even after, ranking him ahead of Anzalone this week, which is hard to do for me, knowing one guy is a locked-in 100% starter and the other isn't. But it paid off this time, and if this is the usage going forward, then there's no reason it shouldn't continue to work out in Campbell's favor. We know what Anzalone is as a tackler, like he's mid at best, where Campbell could be a much more consistent and effective IDP. So I'm excited about this one. I think you guys should be too, especially like you patient dynasty managers who have waited so long for this emergence for Jack Campbell. Again, feeling optimistic because this is the only time we've seen so far in his career him play back-to-back games of 90% plus worth of defensive snaps. So really positive stuff there for Jack Campbell, and hopefully that sticks going forward. Seems like it will. One of the other really interesting linebacker situations I think kind of worth highlighting this week is the Los Angeles Rams, who, as we know, placed Troy Reader on injured reserve right before their Thursday night football game last week. And everyone was talking about, Omar Spates, that's the next guy. Yeah, it doesn't look like that's the case, because actually it's a player that I don't think anyone expected. And it's another UDFA rookie, but it's Jaylen Mulla, a safety who stepped into what was essentially the LB2 role for the Rams this week. McCullough played 70% of the total defensive snaps, with 70% of those snaps lined up as an actual linebacker. So he managed 6 tackles and an interception, which somehow happens to be his 4th interception of the year, despite not playing more than 18 defensive snaps in any one game prior to this one. Now listed as a safety, McCullough really, like, if he keeps this role, this could be a real cheat code for IDP purposes, especially if he could get that snap share, that overall snap share up a little bit more. But for IDP purposes, like he's essentially playing linebacker here, really. probably more, because it wasn't a 100% snap roll, it was around 70%, probably more useful for a deeper league since he wasn't that, again, 100% snap player, but still a better option than maybe a lot of 100% snap safeties just because of his usage around the line of scrimmage, right? So, I mean, I found this very interesting that it wasn't Quentin Lake, it wasn't Cameron Curl taking that linebacker role next to Christian Roseboom, but it was Jaylen Mulla, right? So, really interesting name here to kind of, I think he's definitely worth adding off the waiver wires right now. Whether you're going to start him or not, we'll have to see, but it depends on your league size and who your other options are, but could be a really nice option here at safety. Speaking of Cam Curl, just quickly, by the way, he only played 50% of snaps in this game. Not sure if he got hurt again or what, but he didn't play in the fourth quarter or overtime at all. So he was questionable coming into the week dealing with an ankle injury, but yeah, not great for him right now, Cameron Curl, as he's been kind of trending down here over the past couple of weeks with that injury. All right, let's head to the Denver Broncos now, where Sean Payton and company have decided that the best plan for their linebacker core is to give more playing time to Quan Alexander. So what it looked like this week was Cody Barton remained the full-time linebacker that he's been with no Alex Kingleton in the lineup. However, the second linebacker spot is essentially non-existent right now because Justin Sternad, who had been playing really well, gets demoted for the 30-year-old journeyman linebacker, Quan Alexander. And really kind of just another example of how coaches kind of value experience, potentially even over talent at times, because only 13 defensive snaps for Justin Sternad against the Ravens this week, 32 for Quan Alexander for a 56% snap share. Now, we'll see if this role for Alexander continues to grow, because 56% snap share, it's just not enough to trust in most IDP formats. Really, right now, it's just kind of a mess as the domino effect of losing Singleton just continues to hurt us IDP managers, as now Cody Barton is the only Denver linebacker worth trusting at this point. Okay, staying in the same game, the Baltimore Ravens linebackers provided the opposite IDP value for their second linebacker. As for the second straight week, Trenton Simpson played a full-time role. Simpson heading into last week, he was around about a 71% snap average, but played all but 3 snaps last week and all but 2 snaps this week as the team kind of continues to, I guess, adjust their defensive personnel. Right now, a few important things to keep in mind here that could be affecting Simpson's usage. And the first being that the Ravens, they did not have Marlon Humphrey last week, and then he was eased back in this week for only about half the snaps. Last week, they also benched Marcus Williams, their starting safety, and replaced him with Eddie Jackson, who has been more of their sub-package safety. And this week, Marcus Williams was back as a starter, and Eddie Jackson was inactive for this game. Now, I'm talking about defensive backs. Why the hell does that matter for linebacker Trenton Simpson? And here's at least my kind of read on it. And maybe I'm wrong. I'm not John Harbaugh, right? But it has a lot to do with Kyle Hamilton's usage, because he's really kind of the centerpiece to this defense. He's their best player, and how they plan to utilize him kind of affects the rest of the defenders. And over these past 2 weeks, instead of letting him play the majority of snaps in the box, which Kyle Hamilton had been doing from weeks like 4 to 7, where he was playing between 42% to 59% of his snaps in the box. And then they let Marlon Humphrey play more in the slot to free up Hamilton to essentially play some linebacker. These past 2 weeks, they didn't have kind of their full complement of defensive back starters, right, to allow for that kind of usage, right? In week 8, no Marlon Humphrey, no Marcus Williams, meant more typical safety usage, more slot usage for Hamilton, left a hole in the box, opening up a larger role for Trenton Simpson, right? Same thing this week. No Eddie Jackson, who had been working as their dime safety, and only easing in Marlon Humphrey kind of meant the same thing for Hamilton and then for Simpson as well. So you'll notice fewer box snaps for Kyle Hamilton these past few weeks and more work in the slot, which it's been fine for him. He's been excellent, but it's been even better for Trenton Simpson right now. Because of all this, there's at least a chance that this usage doesn't stick going forward. Again, just depending on who the Ravens have available to them at defensive back and how much they plan on playing them. But if we see that snap decrease next game for Simpson, I wouldn't be surprised. And I'm sure if we looked at DB usage in that game, it might look a lot more like what we were getting in that week 4 to 7 stretch, essentially. So that's a lot of words to explain Trenton Simpson's usage. You'll see Roquan Smith's usage as well, 75% of snaps. There was a lot of garbage time in this game as well. So that also could have played a part into Roquan playing less because he didn't play in garbage time. And then Trenton Simpson staying on as well kind of bumped up his snaps quite a bit as well. So a lot of things kind of going on here in Baltimore, but just something to keep an eye on because I don't necessarily trust that Trenton Simpson full-time role to stick for the rest of the season, depending on how they go with their DBs going forward. Okay, how about something a bit easier to dissect, at least usage wise? So we'll head to Tennessee, where for the second straight week after acquiring Jerome Baker, it was Kenneth Murray and Jack Gibbens who played every snap, even though Baker was active for this game, which he wasn't last week. Now, relatively early in this game, Baker was already in the medical tent getting checked out, but didn't see or hear anything after that. Um, Baker did not play any defensive snaps in this game. Daryl Baker, the cornerback, played, but no Jerome Baker. So I had alluded to just adding Jack Gibbens last week if you had the roster space, and for now, until we hear something about Jerome Baker, we might just treat this as Murray and Gibbons as LB1 and LB2 going forward, which is kind of like what we thought it was going to be for most of the offseason before they traded for Ernest Jones, right? So something to kind of monitor there in Tennessee, but something going on there with Jerome Baker that he wasn't even able to get onto the field this week. All right, the Miami Dolphins linebackers are another interesting situation to keep an eye on going forward because um, after whatever it was the past couple of weeks where we were tracking David Long's usage and finally feeling comfortable with his snaps, he has seemingly been benched for Anthony Walker because Anthony Walker played every defensive snap alongside Jordan Brooks this week, and David Long did not play at all. So obviously, we can't start David Long next week. After this, I know I had him in at least one lineup this week, and obviously got a goose egg out of him. And I'm not sure I'm not the only one because this was an expected full time role, and they didn't make him inactive. They just flat out benched him. So we'll have to kind of monitor whether we can trust Anthony Walker in our lineups. I'm definitely adding Walker as a waiver option, but there might be like some hesitancy in kind of fully embracing him as a starter because we've seen teams do this before, right? Where a player gets benched and it turns out to just be a 1 week thing. So unless we get word from the team that this is the usage going forward, or until we see it at least a couple weeks in a row, I don't know that we necessarily treat Walker as like a trustworthy option in week 10, but worth a speculative add right now. And then David Long does remain on at least our IDP benches. Quick update for the Jacksonville linebackers as well, and this might just be a regular rotation in the recap pod because Ryan Nielsen continues that rotation of his own with this group. Now Foye Oluokun played 90% of snaps, which is fine, though not perfect, obviously, but he did play on every drive this week instead of taking like an entire drive off or multiple drives off. There were only like a couple of drives where he came off the field and just for a few snaps, but that was about it, and basically made the difference in his overall total. Devin Lloyd and Ventrell Miller continued to take turns on drives, with Lloyd getting just a bit more work and playing a little bit more this week, but we've seen that be up and down all season between him and Ventrell Miller. Okay, the New England Patriots were of interest to us last week, and we knew we'd check in on them again after seemingly the team gave the LB1 role to Christian Ellis over Jelani Tavai. Well, not quite. So last week it was an 84% snap share for Christian Ellis, which isn't full time, but it did lead the Patriots linebackers since Tavai was at 79%, and Ellis was clearly the go-to on those like obvious passing downs. And Ellis still led the way on like third and fourth downs, but it wasn't as clear of a lead in his favor. And more importantly, those early downs were not close. Like they were almost an even split between the two last week. This week it was Jelani Tavai played about 59 of 60 first and second down snaps. Christian Ellis only played 33 of the 60. So that ultimately was the big difference between the two this week. At this point, it's just really hard to trust any New England linebackers. I know Tavai had a nice IDP game because he got a pick, but really not banking on him to do much each week in such a sporadic role. And that's the same with Ellis now as well. So even without Bill Belichick there, we still get the same old shenanigans with our IDPs, which is obviously frustrating. Staying in New England and taking a look at the safety group, specifically Marte Mapu, who has been disappointing IDP managers after getting some really great utilization early in his starting debut. That's really trailed off here over the last 2 weeks because last week Mapu played just 31% of snaps in the box, which was a big drop off from the 68% that it was in week 7. And then this week, the first major concern was that he left the game for a stint, but he missed about 18 defensive snaps, but was able to come back in. But when he was on the field, is the other concern is he played just 26% of snaps in the box. So even lower than last week, and then 42% deep. So he managed 6 tackles, which is actually fine, especially considering he missed the 18 snaps, like I said. But this might not be like the Kyle Duggar 2.0 option for IDP that we had hoped he could be going forward. Just something to keep an eye on with Mapu. Might be just more of a matchup dependent guy. But speaking of Kyle Duggar as well, he was inactive for this game, second straight missed game for him, dealing with an ankle injury. Now there was some talk this week about him being a potential trade candidate, which I don't know, man. They just re-signed him this offseason, and he's one of leaders on this defense. I think it would surprise me, but you just never know. If the offer's right, it isn't impossible, things like that. But I don't think Duggar will be traded. I think he'll probably be back next week. It seemed like he was close this week, but Mapu specifically, again, probably just a matchup dependent safety option at this point, unless we see that usage get a little bit better. But that just isn't there right now. Speaking of safety usage, I want to highlight Jeremy Chinn next, who had his best game of the season, leading the team with 12 total tackles. Only the second time this season that he's hit the double-digit tackle mark. So this was really, only his second big game of the season for IDP. So the question likely will be, did his usage change at all? And the answer to that is yes and no. And by that, I mean that he played 48% of snaps in the box, which was obviously better than the 27% that he played last week. But it's also the fourth time that he played at least 48% of the snaps in the box, while he's had 5 games where his usage was closer to what we saw in week 8. So this has just been it just hasn't been a consistent role for Chinn, which is why his production has also been pretty inconsistent. If we start to see him string together a few games in a row where he's playing heavily in the box, then I'll feel a lot better about moving him up in the rankings into that kind of every week starter territory. But that just hasn't been the case this season. So we'll see if that changes at all rest of season. But for now, Jeremy Chinn really just had a nice game. We're treating this as, I guess just I don't know how to explain what I'm trying to say, but it's one of those random games. Every safety has them. They have their big tackle games, and his usage just being as inconsistent as it's been this season. It's going to be hard to trust that kind of going forward. So we'll see if it does stick, but I'm imagining it continues to be inconsistent here. Okay, wrapping up with maybe one of the more interesting safety situations to monitor, the Cincinnati Bengals safeties, where we covered this one a couple weeks ago, talking about how Jordan Battle had been very slowly eating his way into Von Bell's snap share, but then that didn't really continue in week 8 for whatever reason. Instead of continuing to get more of his own drives alongside Geno Stone, Jordan Battle had only got 1 drive last week on his own. And Kyle and I talked about it in the preview show this past week, how maybe we spooked them because we caught on to their plan. We even called them out for being cowards, not playing Jordan Battle more. And hey, maybe that worked because this week was the biggest snap share of the season for Jordan Battle, who played 51% of the defensive snaps this week, which was even more than Von Bell, who played 49%. Now, this game did get out of hand as the Bengals really won quite comfortably against the Raiders. So I thought maybe this was like a garbage time thing. However, it was just a true rotation in every sense of the word, because as the snap shares would indicate there, these two really just took turns taking drives where it was literally Bell would take a drive, then Battle would take one, then Bell would take one, then Battle. And it just continued that way for the entire game. Now, for IDP purposes, obviously we can't trust either guy next game, especially if that rotation just continues each week to allow Battle to get more reps. But at the very least, the Bengals are maybe finally recognizing that Battle is the future of the position for them and not Bell. So there's now at least, I guess, a better chance that Battle overtakes Bell completely at some point this season, where before, because it was such a slow, gradual process where we were seeing those snap shares, it didn't seem as likely. But this was definitely a bigger jump. For those of you watching on YouTube, you see the chart there, and the trend dropped off last week, but it made a big jump this week. So exciting stuff for dynasty managers who had been holding out hope for Battle to return to kind of starter status, and definitely worth keeping an eye on for redraft purposes as well, because this is the more box heavy role too. So could be a nice role for Battle, and hopefully he gets there before the season ends, and while we can still make use of him for IDP purposes. And then for Von Bell, it just means he's probably droppable at this point. There are way too many safeties out there that we can be looking to start. So there's no real reason to hold on to a guy like Bell, given the declining usage, right? All right, that is going to do it for me this week for at least our main IDP takeaways, and of course, a lot more will be covered in the IDP Fantasy Report, which will be out Tuesday afternoon, like I said, and we'll be going game by game as well in the IDP Start Sit show later in the week, and I'll cover a lot of the stuff that maybe we didn't cover in here in there as well. So thank you all for tuning in. If you'd be so kind, as always, to like and subscribe to the channel, I'd greatly appreciate it. Or if you're an audio listener on Apple Podcasts, we would love a 5-star review. It helps us a ton. I really appreciate it. So thank you again for those that have done that already. You guys, I truly do appreciate it. You're the best. As is the PFF data collection team. A huge shout out to them for collecting all of this data. Obviously, the best team in the multiverse. So as always, feel free to ask questions in the comments. And until next time, peace out.